The Curse of the Pink Palace. In 1973, the United States government was offered the ultimate gift. It was a gesture of such staggering scale that it seemed to belong to a bygone era of emperors and czars. Marjorie Merriweather Post, the richest woman in America and the undisputed queen of Palm Beach, had died. In her will, she left a pink palace of 126 rooms, sitting on 17 acres of the most valuable land on earth, to the people of the United States. She envisioned it as the Winter White House, a place where presidents could retreat from the cold of Washington to host world leaders amidst gold-leafed ceilings and 15th-century Spanish tiles. It was a $100 million legacy, gift-wrapped and handed over for free. But the government didn't say thank you. They looked at the keys, looked at the looming shadows of the Great Tower, and they said no. By 1980, the most magnificent home in American history had become a burden so heavy it was crushing the very legacy Marjorie had spent a lifetime building. It was a ghost ship in the sand. The question isn't just why they rejected it. The question is, how did Marjorie's dream become a curse that no one could afford to carry? If you had stood on South Ocean Boulevard in the late 1970s, you wouldn't have seen a symbol of power. You would have seen a tragedy in stone. The air in the ballroom didn't smell like champagne anymore. It smelled of salt and silence. The Atlantic Ocean, which Marjorie had spent millions trying to keep at bay, was finally winning. The salt spray was a silent thief, creeping through the cracks in the 16th-century windows, eating away at the gold leaf that covered the walls of the Grand Salon. The dust sat thick on the Tsar's furniture, treasures smuggled out of a falling Soviet Union, now sitting in a house that was falling just as surely. Mar-a-Lago was built to be sea to lake, a bridge between the wild Atlantic and the calm Lake Worth, but by 1980, it was a bridge to nowhere. The old money elite of Palm Beach, the people Marjorie had ruled over with a velvet glove for decades, drove past the gates in their Rolls Royces and looked away. In the high society circles of the Everglades Club, they spoke of the house in whispers. It was a white elephant, a dinosaur, a monument to an era of excess that the new cynical America of the 1970s wanted to forget. Marjorie had left a $3 million maintenance fund, a fortune by any standard, but Mar-a-Lago was a monster that ate money. The tax bill alone was $1 million a year. The air conditioning was failing. The roof, covered in rare tiles from old Spanish villas, was leaking. To the Nixon and Carter administrations, Mar-a-Lago wasn't a gift, it was a liability. It was a 126-room headache that required a staff of 60 just to keep the jungle from reclaiming the driveway. There is a specific kind of sadness in a house built for thousands that sits in total silence. Marjorie Merriweather Post was a woman who hated silence. She filled her life with the roar of parties, the hum of industry, and the chatter of the world's elite. She believed that through sheer force of will and an endless supply of post-serial gold, she could create something that would last forever. She didn't realize that in the world of the ultra-wealthy, the only thing more expensive than building a dream is maintaining it after the dreamer is gone. Marjorie's life was defined by a struggle between her immense kindness and the cold, mathematical reality of her wealth. She treated her footmen like family, but she also knew the exact cost of every ounce of caviar. She was a woman who could negotiate a multi-million-dollar merger before breakfast, yet she died terrified that the house she loved would be carved up by developers into tiny, nameless lots. As the 80s dawned, the threat of the bulldozer loomed. The daughters of Marjorie Merriweather Post, women who had grown up in this palace, were desperate. They were the heirs to one of the greatest fortunes in history, yet they were being bled dry by a house they couldn't sell. How did we get here? To understand why the Pink Palace was rotting, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to a time when the Post name wasn't on a building, but on a cardboard box. We have to meet the serial king's daughter, the little girl who was taught that in the Post family, you don't just buy the future, you build it. Before the 126 rooms, before the Soviet treasures, and before the name Post was a global titan of industry, there was a small experimental kitchen in Battle Creek, Michigan. And in that kitchen was a man named C.W. Post, a man whose nerves had been shattered by a series of business failures and a mental breakdown. But C.W. Post didn't just want to heal himself. He wanted to change the way America ate. And at his side, glued to his every move, was his only child, Marjorie. Most girls of the Victorian era were being groomed for embroidery and piano recitals. Marjorie Merriweather Post was being groomed for a throne. While her peers played with porcelain dolls, Marjorie was in the Postum factory, learning the specific gravity of cereal grains and the chemistry of coffee substitutes. Her father didn't treat her like a daughter, he treated her like a junior partner. C.W. Post was a marketing genius, perhaps the first of his kind. He understood that you don't sell a product, you sell a feeling. He sold Postum as a health miracle. He sold grape nuts as brain food. And as he built this empire of cardboard boxes, he took Marjorie into the boardroom. By the age of 10, she was sitting in on executive meetings. By 15, she was helping him plan national advertising campaigns. He taught her the old money philosophy that would define her life. Wealth is not for luxury. Wealth is for leverage. He once told her, "Marjorie, you are a Post. That means you are responsible for everyone who eats our food and everyone who works our lines." But there was a darkness beneath the success. C.W. Post struggled with his demons, what we would today call clinical depression. Marjorie watched as the man who built an empire of health struggled to find his own peace. This instilled in her a frantic, almost desperate need for order and beauty. If the world was chaotic, her home would be perfect. If people were unreliable, her standards would be absolute. The Postum secrets were simple: high margins, aggressive branding, and obsessive quality control. Marjorie mastered them all. But she also learned the isolation of the rich girl. In Battle Creek, she was the princess of a company town. She saw how the workers looked at her father, with a mix of reverence and resentment. It was here that she developed her noblesse oblige. She realized that to keep the crown, she had to be more than a boss. She had to be a protector. Then, in 1914, the world shifted. C.W. Post, plagued with ill health and fearing the loss of his mental faculties, took his own life. At just 27 years old, Marjorie was no longer an apprentice. She was the sole heir to a $20 million fortune, nearly $600 million in today's currency. The old money establishment of New York waited for the cereal girl to fail. They expected her to marry a playboy, spend the money on hats, and fade into the social registers. They didn't realize that C.W. Post hadn't just left her money, he had left her his teeth. She didn't sell the company, she didn't hide. Instead, she looked at the Postum cereal company and decided it wasn't big enough. She began to eye other brands: Jell-O, Maxwell House, Bird's Eye. She was about to invent the modern conglomerate. She was about to become the richest woman in the world. But as the millions began to pile into billions, a void began to grow. Marjorie realized that while she could control a boardroom, she couldn't control the way she was perceived. She was new money to the Astors and the Vanderbilts. To them, she was just the girl from Battle Creek. Mar-a-Lago wasn't born out of a need for a house. It was born out of a need for a fortress, a place so grand, so untouchable, that no one, not the New York elite, not the kings of Europe, and certainly not the memory of her father, could ever look down on her again. She had the money, she had the ambition. Now she just needed the land, and she was willing to crawl through the mud to find it. moving from the dusty factory floors of Battle Creek to the glittering, cold penthouses of New York City.
The $250 million heiress. By the early 1920s, Marjorie Merriweather Post was no longer just the serial king's daughter. She was a force of nature. While the rest of the world's wealthy women were occupied with the 4 C's, clothing, charity, children, and church, Marjorie was focused on a 5th, consolidation. She looked at the American kitchen and saw a fragmented mess. Every town had its own brand of flour, its own coffee roaster, its own jam maker. Marjorie, with the cold eye of a grand strategist, realized that if she could own the entire pantry, she could own the American home. This was the birth of General Foods. Marjorie didn't just inherit wealth, she weaponized it. In an era where women weren't even allowed in many boardrooms, she was the one directing the symphony of acquisitions. She brought Jell-O, she bought Maxwell House, she bought Bird's Eye frozen foods after seeing a demonstration of flash freezing on a hunting trip. By 1927, her net worth was estimated at $250 million. In today's money, that is roughly $4.5 billion. But even that number doesn't capture the true scale of her power. In the 1920s, there was no income tax as we know it today, and the dollar had the weight of lead. She was, quite literally, the richest woman in the world. But Marjorie learned a bitter lesson early on. Wealth buys comfort, but it doesn't always buy entry. The Knickerbocker elite of New York, the families whose money was centuries old, still viewed the Posts as merchants. They looked at her fortune and smelled the yeast and the grain dust of Michigan. This rejection fueled a magnificent obsession. If she couldn't join their world, she would build a world so superior that they would have to beg to enter hers. She began to live on a scale that made the Vanderbilts look like paupers. She commissioned the Sea Cloud, the largest private sailing yacht ever built, a 4-masted bark that required a crew of 72 just to hoist the sails. She bought the Hillwood estate in D.C. She bought Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks, but her heart was set on the new playground of the elite, Palm Beach. To understand Marjorie's wealth, you have to understand her philosophy of the best. She didn't want the most expensive version of an object. She wanted the only version. She wanted the diamonds that belonged to Marie Antoinette. She wanted the silver that belonged to the Tsars. She wanted a lifestyle that was a fortress against the mundane. Yet behind the most powerful woman headlines, the math of her life was becoming complicated. She was married to E.F. Hutton, the legendary Wall Street broker, but even in their marriage there was a power struggle. Hutton was a titan of finance, but he was spending her money. The tension between her role as a traditional wife and her reality as a corporate sovereign began to create the first cracks in her golden facade. She needed a project. She needed a monument that would cement the Post name in the history books forever. She didn't want a winter cottage, she wanted a citadel. In 1924, she packed her bags and headed south to a swampy, mosquito-infested strip of jungle in Florida. She was about to find the site of Mar-a-Lago, and in doing so, she was about to build a house that would eventually eat her legacy alive. The Swamp and the Vision. In 1924, Palm Beach was not the manicured paradise we see today. It was a rugged barrier island dominated by jagged coral reefs and impenetrable mangroves. Most of the old money families had built their homes on the lakeside to avoid the brutal salt spray of the Atlantic. But Marjorie Merriweather Post didn't want to hide from the ocean, she wanted to command it. She and E.F. Hutton spent weeks trekking through the undergrowth. They weren't staying in luxury hotels, they were literally crawling through the brush, fending off mosquitoes and snakes. Marjorie was looking for a very specific piece of geology, a high ridge of ancient coral that stretched from the sea to the lake.
When she finally found it, the 17 acres that would become Mar-a-Lago, she didn't see a swamp, she saw a Mediterranean dream. She saw a 75-foot tower that would act as a beacon for ships at sea. She saw a house that would be built not on sand, but on the very bedrock of Florida. She hired Marion Sims to Wyeth to design the bones and Joseph Urban, the legendary stage designer for the Ziegfeld Follies, to design the soul. Urban brought a theatrical, almost hallucinogenic grandeur to the project. He didn't want to build a home, he wanted to build a set for the greatest show on earth. The old money neighbors thought she was insane. They called it Post's Folly. They said the location was too exposed, the design too gaudy, and the cost too astronomical. Marjorie didn't care. She was the woman who had turned Postum into a global empire. To her, the swamp was just raw material. She was about to spend $7 million, the equivalent of $120 million today, on a house that would take 3 years and 600 workers to complete. It was the largest construction project in the history of Florida. But as the first blocks of Dorian stone were hauled from the sea, a dark irony was already taking root. Marjorie was building a house for a future that didn't exist yet. She was building a palace for a queen in a country that was supposed to be a republic. And the very coral reef she fought so hard to build upon would eventually become the cage that trapped her. The sheer scale of what happened next defies modern comprehension. We are moving into the heart of the construction, the moment where money is no object, transitioned from a phrase into a terrifying reality.
Building a monster. In 1924, Marjorie didn't just break ground, she declared war on the landscape. To build Mar-a-Lago, she didn't hire a local contractor and buy lumber from the yard. She effectively launched a private invasion of the Mediterranean. She wanted the house to look like it had been pulled, fully formed, from the cliffs of the Italian Riviera. To achieve this, she commissioned 3 entire boatloads of Dorian stone from Italy, stone that was so heavy and so precious that special barges had to be constructed just to ferry it across the Atlantic. But the stone was just the skeleton. The skin of the house was where the true madness lay. Marjorie and her designer, Joseph Urban, developed an obsession with the 15th century. They sourced 36,000 ancient Spanish tiles, some dating back to the 1400s, stripped from old villas and monasteries across Europe. Think about the logistics. Every tile had to be cataloged, shipped, and hand-placed by master craftsmen who were flown in from Europe because American laborers simply didn't have the old-world touch she demanded. If a single pattern was off by an inch, Marjorie would have the wall torn down and rebuilt. The cost was staggering. She was spending roughly $250,000 a month in 1925 dollars. While the average American was earning $1,300 a year, Marjorie was spending that every 4 hours on gold leaf and silk wall coverings. The centerpiece was the living room, a space so vast it felt like a cathedral. The ceiling was a literal replica of the 1,000-wing ceiling in the Accademia in Venice, covered in gold leaf so thick it was said you could scrape it off with a knife and pay for a car. This wasn't just a house, it was a monster that required constant feeding. To support the 75-foot tower, they had to drill deep into the Florida coral, anchoring the structure to the very spine of the earth. Marjorie was building for eternity. She believed by using the materials of the past, the stone of Italy, the tiles of Spain, the gold of the Venetians, she could buy her way out of the new money stigma. But as the final roof tile was laid in 1927, the old money elite in their modest shingle-style cottages looked at the 126-room behemoth and didn't see beauty. They saw a woman trying too hard. They saw a monster that would eventually need a village to survive. The Queen of Palm Beach. When the gates of Mar-a-Lago finally swung open in 1927, Marjorie Merriweather Post didn't just move in, she took the throne. For the next 40 years, she was the undisputed Queen of Palm Beach. If you weren't invited to Mar-a-Lago, you didn't exist in society. But Marjorie wasn't a snob in the traditional sense. She practiced a form of noblesse oblige that was as rigid as it was generous. She treated her staff of 70 like a private army, providing them with health care and retirement long before it was standard. But in return, she expected perfection. Every footman's glove had to be bleached white. Every silver fork had to be aligned to the millimeter. The parties at Mar-a-Lago were the stuff of legend. She once hired an entire circus, elephants, acrobats, and clowns to perform on the back lawn for her guests. She hosted the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Winston Churchill, and every titan of industry from Rockefeller to Ford. But her favorite tradition was far humbler: square dancing. Every Thursday, the wealthiest people in the world were required to don Western shirts and denim to square dance in the gold-leafed ballroom. It was Marjorie's way of reminding everyone that she was still, at heart, the girl from Battle Creek. Yet, beneath the laughter and the square dance calls, there was a growing sense of isolation. To be the Queen of Mar-a-Lago was to be a woman who was never told no. Her wealth acted as a barrier between her and the truth. Her husbands, and there would be 4 of them, often felt like accessories to the house. She was a woman who could host 1,000 people, but often dined alone with her dogs in a room that sat 50. She was discovering the tragic paradox of the great heiress. The more space you own, the further away everyone else becomes. Marjorie had built a stage for the world, but the world was changing. The 1920s were ending in a crash, and the 1930s would bring a new, darker chapter. She was about to go from the Queen of Palm Beach to a secret player in the most dangerous political game on earth: Moscow. From the sun-drenched terrace of Palm Beach to the cold, paranoid streets of Stalinist Russia, the story of Marjorie Merriweather Post takes a turn into the shadows of the Cold War.
The Ambassador's Wife. In 1935, Marjorie married her 3rd husband, Joseph E. Davies, a high-powered lawyer and close friend of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. When FDR appointed Davies as the 2nd U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, the Queen of Palm Beach didn't retreat. She packed 2,000 pints of frozen cream, 2 tons of high-grade beef, and her finest furs. She was going to Moscow. Living in the Soviet Union in the 1930s was like living in a gilded cage. While the Russian people were starving and Stalin was purging his enemies, Marjorie and Joe lived in Spaso House, the American embassy. But it was a house with ears. Marjorie was no fool. She knew the walls were teeming with microphones. She and Joe would play loud music or whisper in the center of the room to discuss state secrets. But while Joe handled the politics, Marjorie was handling the art. The Soviets were desperate for hard currency to fuel their industrial machine. They looked at the priceless treasures of the fallen Romanov Tsars, imperial chalices, Fabergé eggs, and liturgical vestments, and they saw junk from a dead era. Marjorie saw an opportunity. With the same predatory instinct she used to build General Foods, she began buying the Tsar's heritage for pennies on the dollar. She was essentially looting the history of a collapsed empire to decorate her own. She bought Catherine the Great's porcelain and the wedding crown of the last Tsar's daughter. These treasures, which would later fill the rooms of Mar-a-Lago and Hillwood, were the spoils of a woman who knew that in a world of chaos, gold and art were the only things that held their value. But Moscow changed her. It gave her a taste of real-world stakes and a deep, gnawing paranoia. She realized that even the greatest empires, like the 300-year Romanov dynasty, could vanish overnight. It made her cling even tighter to the one thing she could control, her property. The cracks in the gold leaf. By the 1950s, Marjorie was back in the United States, but the world she knew was fading. She was now in her 60s, and the woman who has everything was finding that everything was becoming remarkably quiet. Her marriages had all followed a tragic pattern. She would marry men of high status and ambition, but they would inevitably struggle to live in the shadow of her wealth. To marry Marjorie was to become a guest in her life. One husband, Herbert May, was discovered to have a secret double life, leading to a humiliating and quiet divorce. The loneliness began to manifest in physical ways. Marjorie was losing her hearing, but ever the perfectionist, she refused to let the world see her weakness. She had her hearing aids custom-built into massive, glittering diamond earrings. She was literally masking her silence with brilliance. She continued to host her square dances and her gala dinners, but she was becoming a relic. The old money world was being replaced by a faster, louder, and more casual society. Her three daughters, most notably the actress Dina Merrill, lived their own lives, often miles away from the crushing responsibility of the Post legacy. Marjorie began to realize that she was the last of the Mohicans. She looked at the 126 rooms of Mar-a-Lago and saw not a home, but a burden. She was spending $2 million a year just to keep the lights on and the dust off the Russian gold. She began to obsess over what would happen when she was gone. She couldn't bear the thought of a developer turning her pink palace into a golf course or a series of condos. This was the moment of the final wish. Marjorie decided she would give the house to the only entity she felt was grand enough to deserve it, the United States government. She wasn't just giving them a house, she was giving them a destiny. She was giving them a winter White House. She believed she was securing her immortality. She didn't realize that she was setting the stage for the most expensive rejection in history. Marjorie was now playing a game of legacy chess. She wasn't just thinking about the next decade, she was thinking about the next century. But the old money logic she used to protect her home was about to collide with the cold, bureaucratic reality of a changing America.
The final wish. As Marjorie entered her 80s, her focus shifted from living to lasting. She knew that even a fortune of hundreds of millions could be evaporated by the sheer gravity of Mar-a-Lago. It was a black hole of maintenance. She didn't want her daughters to be house poor, chained to a 126-room monster they didn't want. In 1969, she made her move. She officially designated Mar-a-Lago as a gift to the United States government. She envisioned it as a presidential retreat, a Camp David for the tropics. She imagined the leaders of the free world strolling through her gardens, negotiating peace treaties under her Spanish tiles. To ensure the government couldn't say no, she didn't just give them the house. She set up a $3 million endowment, nearly $25 million today, to pay for its upkeep. She thought she had thought of everything. She was handing over a turnkey palace, staffed and funded for the glory of the Republic. President Nixon accepted the gift with a smile. Why wouldn't he? It was a free palace. Marjorie felt a sense of peace. Her life's work, her pink palace, was now a part of American history. She had achieved the ultimate old money goal. She had made herself indispensable to the state. But the irony of Marjorie's life was that she was always one step ahead of the market, but one step behind the culture. She lived in a world where great houses were respected. But in the 1970s, America was in a different mood. The Vietnam War, Watergate, and a grinding recession were making the public and the government wary of anything that smelled like imperial excess. Marjorie spent her final years in a state of regal delusion, believing she had saved Mar-a-Lago. She died in 1973 at the age of 86, draped in the jewels of the Tsars and the certainty of her legacy. She was buried in the gardens of her other estate, Hillwood,
but her heart remained at the sea to lake. The Great Rejection. Marjorie was barely cold in the ground before the math began to fail. That $3 million endowment? It was a drop in the bucket. By 1974, inflation was spiraling. The cost of maintaining 126 rooms in a salt-air environment was skyrocketing. The National Park Service took one look at the books and panicked. It wasn't just the $1 million a year in basic maintenance, it was the security. To protect a president at Mar-a-Lago would cost millions more. The gift was starting to look like a Trojan horse. Then came the Jimmy Carter administration. Carter, the peanut farmer from Georgia, was the antithesis of the cereal queen from Battle Creek. To a country standing in gas lines, the idea of the government spending tax dollars to polish the gold leaf of an heiress's ballroom was political suicide. In 1969, in an act that would have broken Marjorie's heart, the U.S. government did the unthinkable. They officially rejected the gift. They handed the keys back to the Post Foundation and said, "We don't want it. We can't afford it." This was the ultimate betrayal of her legacy. Marjorie had spent 50 years building a fortress of old money permanence, only to have the most powerful nation on earth say it wasn't worth the trouble. The house was suddenly a white elephant in a shark tank. The tax bill was accruing. The gardens were becoming a jungle. The Post daughters, Dina Merrill and her sisters, were now trapped. They were paying millions to maintain a ghost house they couldn't live in and couldn't give away. The tragedy of Marjorie Merriweather Post had entered its final, most desperate phase, the fire sale. This is the final descent, the moment where the old money fortress finally cracked and a new, louder era of American wealth broke down the gates.
The demolition threat. By 1983, the Pink Palace was no longer a palace. It was a 126-room liability. The Post daughters were desperate. They had tried to give it to the government, they had tried to give it to the state of Florida, and they had even considered turning it into a private club themselves. But everyone saw the same thing, a money pit that could swallow a fortune whole. The estate was listed for $20 million. No one called. They dropped it to $15 million. Still, the phone remained silent. In the high-stakes world of Palm Beach real estate, Mar-a-Lago had become toxic. The wealthy elite of the 1980s didn't want 15th-century Spanish tiles. They wanted sleek, modern mansions with central air that actually worked. Then, the unthinkable happened. The Post Foundation began to discuss the D word, demolition. The plan was brutal and efficient. They would tear down the house that Marjorie had built with perfection or death in mind. They would scrape the 36,000 ancient tiles into a landfill, bulldoze the 75-foot tower into the sea, and carve the 17 acres into small, 1-acre mini-estates. It was the ultimate erasure of a legacy. Marjorie's dream was about to be turned into a suburban cul-de-sac. But there was a problem. The town of Palm Beach, which had once mocked Marjorie for being too new money, suddenly became the defenders of her ghost. They didn't want the house, but they didn't want the traffic of 10 new mansions either. They blocked the subdivision. They trapped the Post heirs in a financial cage. They couldn't build, they couldn't sell, and they couldn't tear it down. Mar-a-Lago was a dying giant, waiting for someone with enough ego to believe they could tame it. The new king. In 1985, a 39-year-old real estate mogul from Queens named Donald Trump was cruising down South Ocean Boulevard. He had just finished building Trump Tower in New York. He was the personification of the new money that the old money world of Palm Beach feared most, loud, aggressive, and obsessed with the art of the deal. He saw Mar-a-Lago and didn't see a tragedy. He saw an undervalued asset. He saw a trophy that would give him the one thing his billions couldn't yet buy, the status of a king. He started with an insult offer of $5 million. The Post heirs were offended. They turned him down. But Trump knew they were bleeding money. He played a game of hardball that Marjorie herself might have respected. He bought the strip of land between Mar-a-Lago and the ocean and threatened to build a hideous, massive building that would block the palace's view of the sea forever. He devalued the property until he was the only buyer left. In December 1985, he walked away with the keys to the kingdom for just $8 million. Narrator, think about the math. Marjorie spent $7 million in 1924, roughly $120 million today, to build it. She left a $25 million endowment to save it, and it was sold for the price of a mid-sized apartment in Manhattan. The old money era of Marjorie Merriweather Post was over. The era of the brand had begun. Trump didn't preserve the house as a museum. He turned it into a private club. He charged people to enter the world Marjorie had built. He turned her winter White House dream into a reality, though not in the way she ever intended. Marjorie's story is a tragedy of scale. She believed that if you built something grand enough, the world would have no choice but to respect it. She believed that posthum gold could buy immortality. But as the salt air continues to bite at the stones of Mar-a-Lago, the lesson remains. You can build a palace to hide from the world, but you can never build one large enough to hide from time. The serial queen's greatest creation didn't just survive her, it consumed her. Marjorie Merriweather Post wanted a legacy of perfection. What she got was a house that became more famous than her name. The Pink Palace still stands, but the woman who crawled through the swamp to find it has long since faded into the silence of the sea.